Hey there everyone, welcome back for more endocrine physiology. So last time we talked about the hypothalamus and the pituitary and how they basically form this big master control center in determining in a lot of cases which hormones get secreted and at what times in the body. Now they certainly don't have control over every hormone in the body, so we'll try to be clear on when those cases are and when those cases are not. But what we are going to discuss in this video is definitely a case in which we've got a gland, the thyroid, which is definitely regulated by the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So, like I just said, the thyroid is one of those cases, and the gonads, testes, ovaries, and the adrenal cortex are the other examples. Pretty much everything else is going to be acting independently of the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. So, embedded within the thyroid tissue, which you can see wraps around the trachea here, just below the level of the pharynx and larynx here, is the thyroid. So embedded within that thyroid tissue are 4 parathyroid glands, which you can see here kind of in this posterior view. And obviously it's nice to know, based on this picture, that you can see quite a lot of blood supply going into the tissue of the thyroid. And that's good to know because, of course, if you're dealing with an endocrine gland, it makes sense that the blood supply has to be close by because isn't that the whole point of a hormone? It has to travel through the blood. So we'll talk a little bit about the parathyroid glands coming up here in a bit, but let's focus on the thyroid itself for the time being. So the thyroid is going to secrete 2 hormones in response to TSH stimulation from the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary secretes TSH in response to TRH from the hypothalamus. So the 2 thyroid hormones that we are going to talk about here are T3 and T4. So if we take a histological view of what thyroid tissue looks like, you're going to see a lot of these structures, these circular epithelial structures called follicles. So at the center of these follicles, you almost kind of think of it as kind of a gooey center. So that if you're going to think of it that way, the gooey center is what is called colloid. So it is a special type of extracellular fluid. You'll notice that it's at the center of these cells, so it's not actually in cells, it's actually just surrounded by cells. And this colloid is going to be where thyroid hormone is synthesized. And then very clearly here you can see infiltrating capillaries, and like I said, it's good to know that the blood supply is so very close by because once a hormone like thyroid hormone is made, you need to get it into the blood if it's going to act like a hormone. So the colloid does represent where thyroid hormone is produced, and as we're going to see here, this production of thyroid hormone impinges on one very important point. These follicular cells that surround the colloid, they have to be able to absorb iodine from the blood. So iodine, the element iodine, is obtained in the diet as its ionic form, which we call iodide. So iodide is going to be present at very, very, very low concentrations in the blood plasma, certainly when you compare it to something like sodium, potassium, or calcium, or anything else. But the good news is that that doesn't really represent a problem for us because the thyroid is really the only tissue in the whole body that uses iodide for anything at all. So it doesn't really matter that we don't really get a whole lot of it because there's only one part of the body that uses it for anything. So what you're seeing here is a representation of the follicular cells, these little cuboidal epithelial cells that surround the center, the colloid here. So iodide is collected from the blood plasma, from the extracellular fluid via active transport so that we can get it across the basolateral membrane here and then across the apical membrane here to get it into the colloid space there. And from there, we go about making our thyroid hormone. So these follicular cells produce and secrete a large protein called thyroglobulin into the colloid center here. So what's going to happen here is that we are going to take that captured iodide and attach those iodide atoms to the thyroglobulin via enzyme catalysis. So once we do that, which is called the organification of thyroglobulin, once we attach those iodide atoms, other enzymes are going to chop up that thyroglobulin, similar to how POMC got chopped up to produce ACTH. We are going to chop up the thyroglobulin to produce our two thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. So you can see in these pictures, these chemical structures of our two thyroid hormones, the importance of getting iodide out of the blood. So the reason why we call these hormones T3 and T4 is because the number, the 3 and the 4, indicate how many iodide atoms were incorporated into the chemical structure of the hormone. For thyroxine here on the far left, you can count them up: 1, 2, 3, and 4, T4. For T3, which is called triiodothyronine, 1, 2, 3. Count them up, 3, T3. So it should make sense. But one issue that we need to remember that we mentioned much earlier in this chapter is that thyroid hormone is a type of amine hormone. So usually that would mean that it is hydrophilic and it shouldn't have any troubles that any other hydrophilic hormones will have. Well, if you recall, we mentioned that thyroid hormones are a little bit of an enigma. They actually are going to be very hydrophobic, and as such, they are going to require carrier proteins to transport them around throughout the blood. So the next question becomes, for what purpose would we want to secrete thyroid hormone? What the heck does thyroid hormone do? Well, we'll get a little bit of better context for this in a few slides when we discuss what happens when you have too much or too little, hyperthyroidism and hypothyroidism. But basically, the stimulus that would cause the thyroid to want to secrete thyroid hormone is going to be a drop in metabolic rate. So that drop in metabolic rate, or a drop in T3 and T4 concentration in the blood, whichever one you want to call it, that's not going to be sensed by the thyroid itself. Because the thyroid is regulated by the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus, all the thyroid basically does is follow instructions. It's not really capable of making those decisions itself. So what's going to happen here is that the hypothalamus will be the one to sense the drop in metabolic rate. We mentioned that the hypothalamus is a very common sensor of many different things throughout the body, including temperature, osmolarity, and here, metabolic rate. So when the metabolic rate drops, the hypothalamus will secrete and release TRH. That will cause the anterior pituitary to release TSH, and then that TSH will get to the thyroid and stimulate the production of thyroid hormone as we saw it on the previous slides. So what T3 and T4 is going to do is similar to growth hormone. There are T3 and T4 receptors all over the place. But you will recall that because T3 and T4 are hydrophobic, the receptors for these hormones are not going to be on the membrane of target cells, but rather inside the target cells. Specifically, these receptors are on the mitochondria inside of these target cells. So mitochondria will respond to T3 and T4 by ramping up heat production and increasing the flow of cellular respiration so that we make more energy, make more heat, raise our body temperature. So a lot of different things that should cause that initial stimulus to go away, meaning the drop in metabolic rate or the drop in body temperature. And then, as we've seen before in previous videos, the negative feedback will happen via both long loop and short loop feedback. That T3 and T4, once it is produced in copious amounts, those will be able to feed back and shut down the production of both TRH and TSH from the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary respectively, so that we make just the right amount of T3 and T4. As we're going to see when we talk about hypo and hyperthyroidism, you do not want your body making the mistake of making too much or too little of this hormone. We want it to be just right. So just to kind of shore up some of the things that we just mentioned, because thyroid hormone is hydrophobic, its receptor will definitely be inside of target cells all over the body. Thyroid hormone binds to receptors on mitochondria and will stimulate those organelles to ramp up their catabolic activities, so cellular respiration and the like. This will result in a lot of heat being produced, which will increase body temperature. That's an important point for later. So thyroid hormone is absolutely essential for some protein synthesis, some anabolic activities in human development. And even once you've already become an adult, inadequate thyroid hormone production, which is called hypothyroidism, and excessive thyroid hormone production, which is called hyperthyroidism, those can also cause a myriad of other issues and symptoms, as we're going to see here. So hypothyroid in the center column and hyperthyroid on the far right column. So basically all of these symptoms that you're going to see detailed down the leftmost column, you're going to notice that whatever the symptom is, it's basically the exact opposite between hypo and hyperthyroidism. So we're not going to go through all of these, but if you look at activity and sleep, someone who does not make enough thyroid hormone is going to feel tired and they're going to feel like they want to sleep all the time. Someone who is hyperthyroidism is going to be basically bouncing off the walls with energy. They're not going to want to sleep. Temperature tolerance, so someone who's hypothyroidism is going to feel cold all the time because they're not getting that body temperature increase from thyroid hormone. Someone who's hyperthyroid is going to feel hot all the time. So you can kind of go down the list here and see that there is a kind of opposing dichotomy of symptoms here that all have to do with either having too little or too much thyroid hormone. And this should be very applicable to one of the case studies that you're responsible for this week. So speaking of a case study, let's talk about goiters. So goiters are not the most appealing thing to look at in the world. So basically what a goiter is a very swollen thyroid. So in this picture here, you have a woman who is experiencing a goiter, basically an abnormal growth of thyroid tissue. So with that being said, let's talk about what might cause a tissue or a gland to swell up like that. So one of the most common causes of goiters is iodine insufficiency. So even though iodine is not very concentrated in the blood, because we have to obtain iodine from the diet, it is possible to not eat enough food that contains enough iodine. And if that is the case, then your thyroid's not going to be able to make enough thyroid hormone. So on the far left here, you can see the typical hypothalamus anterior pituitary thyroid axis. So just to review here, the hypothalamus, when we want to make thyroid hormone, the hypothalamus will make TRH, that will stimulate the anterior pituitary to make TSH, and that will stimulate the thyroid to make T3 and T4. But the thyroid will only be able to respond to the TSH when iodide is adequate. What if iodide is not adequate? So if the thyroid does not have enough iodine, it's not going to be able to make T3 and T4. So what that's going to do, if we look at it through the lens of negative feedback, typically, when we have enough T3 and T4, we are able to shut down TSH and TRH via negative feedback. Well, if we don't have enough T3 and T4, that negative feedback does not occur. And instead of shutting down the production of TRH and TSH, those hormones are going to start going up in concentration. I always like to put it like this. Look at the anterior pituitary and the thyroid. That TSH is basically a message being sent from the anterior pituitary to the thyroid. The anterior pituitary is saying, hey thyroid, you need to make thyroid hormone, and this TSH is my way of telling you that. Well, from the anterior pituitary's perspective, the thyroid isn't hearing it, right? So the only way the anterior pituitary knows that the thyroid is doing its job is if it sees the thyroid hormone coming back around via that short loop negative feedback. So if T3 and T4 is not being produced, the anterior pituitary is going to assume that the thyroid is not listening to it. So if you're in the same room with someone and they're, say, across the room, and you say something to them and they don't hear you, what's your natural reaction? You're going to say it again, but this time you're going to say it louder, right? That's exactly what the anterior pituitary is going to do. The thyroid didn't hear it the first time, so the anterior pituitary is going to make more TSH with the hopes that this time the thyroid is going to respond. But from the thyroid's perspective, it's saying, look, anterior pituitary, I hear you. I'm getting your TSH, but I literally can't make any more thyroid hormone because I don't have any iodine. Well, that doesn't matter to the anterior pituitary, but that is essentially the justification for why the thyroid is not responding to the TSH, because it doesn't have the necessary materials to make its hormone. So if iodide is inadequate, we get low concentrations of T3 and T4. That prevents our negative feedback from shutting down TSH and TRH. So instead, the anterior pituitary will make even more TSH, and that is going to overstimulate the thyroid. The thyroid is basically being bombarded with TSH molecules, and this introduces a new topic for us. When any tissue in the body is overstimulated, it doesn't have to just be endocrine tissue. When any tissue in the body is overstimulated with a particular ligand, that tissue has a tendency to grow in size, which is a process we call hypertrophy. If you've ever done a lot of weightlifting in your life, you've seen this hypertrophy in action. So when you lift a lot of weights, you are stimulating your muscles a lot with the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. And this is going to cause, the more you lift your weights, your muscle tissue is going to grow in size. That is hypertrophy in action. In this case, it is the thyroid growing in size because it is being overstimulated with thyroid-stimulating hormone, all because we can't get enough iodide out of our diet. So definitely make sure that you're eating food that is rich in iodide so you get enough of it. On the other hand, conversely, it is possible to understimulate a tissue. So if this were a case of TSH levels being abnormally low, then the thyroid would atrophy or lose cell mass. So knowledge of these two processes, both hypertrophy and atrophy, are going to be very important for how you approach your endocrine gland lab this week, because basically what that's going to provide for you is the weighed masses of a lot of different tissues throughout the bodies of these virtual rats, and you should be able to determine which hormone those glands and tissues are being stimulated with or not stimulated with based on whether those tissues grow or shrink in mass. Okay, so that pretty much does it for the thyroid and thyroid hormones, but in addition to the thyroid hormones, the thyroid will also secrete a unrelated hormone called calcitonin. So calcitonin has nothing to do with the sorts of things that thyroid hormone does. What it does do is it has effects on calcium homeostasis. So calcitonin has the somewhat minor effect of lowering the level of calcium in the blood when it gets too high. But this leads us into a discussion on those parathyroid glands, because the parathyroid glands are also involved in calcium homeostasis. So the parathyroid glands secrete a hormone called, appropriately, parathyroid hormone. This hormone is going to raise blood calcium levels when they get too low. So if you compare calcitonin and parathyroid hormone, these are typical antagonistic hormones in the same way that insulin and glucagon were. So it says here that we will more fully discuss the effects of these hormones in Chapter 6, which has to do with bone homeostasis. If you are listening to this lecture in the summer of 2020, Chapter 6 is unfortunately one of the chapters we had to cut. So you can look into Chapter 6 for more information on this. But basically what these hormones are going to do is affect cells in the bone called osteoblasts and osteoclasts and determine whether calcium gets deposited into the bone when it's too high in the blood, or absorbed out of the bone when calcium is too low in the blood. So if you're curious about these processes, Chapter 6 is where that information can be found, but you don't necessarily have to know that in great detail here. So just to give a little bit of extra context, just in case you don't end up going to Chapter 6, which is understandable if, again, you're in the summer of 2020 class, parathyroid hormone is acting in what is called a simple endocrine reflex, right? So this is a case of a gland, the parathyroid glands, which are not under the control of the hypothalamus or the anterior pituitary. So as a simple endocrine reflex, there's only one gland and one hormone. You got the parathyroid acting as both the sensor and the control center, and you've got parathyroid hormone as the output signal. So our targets here, once parathyroid hormone is secreted into the blood, are going to be bone, like I mentioned on the previous slide, the kidneys so that we can reabsorb any calcium that would be excreted through the urine, and then, even though it's not really listed here, the intestines so that we can stimulate extra calcium absorption from the food and the stuff that we eat. So yeah, so to answer these two questions here, the output signal is going to be your parathyroid hormone, and your effectors are going to be the bone, the kidneys, and the intestines there. And you can see some pictures of them right here. All right, so that is going to do it for this video on the thyroid and its hormones. So join us next time, and we will start talking about the adrenal glands and the gonads. So I will sign off for now. See you next time.